Today, I want to speak carefully, humbly, and responsibly. This is not a political endorsement, nor is it an attack. It is a spiritual reflection, a warning rooted in principles, not parties. When we talk about leaders, especially powerful ones, we must remember that God looks at the heart, not the popularity, not the polls, not the platforms. What God showed me was not centered on a man's name, but on what happens when power, pride, destiny, and responsibility collide. History shows us a clear pattern. God raises leaders for purposes, but He also holds them to higher accountability. When a leader is given influence over millions, their words, attitudes, and decisions carry spiritual weight. The warning was this: being chosen does not mean being approved in every action. God can use flawed vessels, but flaws left unchecked can turn purpose into pressure and calling into conflict. Leadership without humility invites division. Authority without wisdom invites chaos. Influence without restraint invites judgment. What shocked me most was not a vision of destruction, but a vision of opportunity at risk. A moment where humility could preserve legacy or pride could distort it. God's warning was not just for one leader, but for a nation watching, cheering, criticizing, and idolizing human strength instead of divine guidance. This is also a warning to believers. Do not confuse boldness with righteousness, noise with truth, or confidence with obedience. God can use anyone, but He will not excuse anyone. When leaders become symbols, people stop praying and start defending. And when prayer stops, discernment dies. This message must be understood first and foremost as a spiritual warning, not a political statement. In a time when everything is quickly divided into sides, parties, and agendas, it is critical to slow down and recognize the difference between political opinion and spiritual discernment. God does not operate within human political systems, and His purposes are not limited by party lines, national borders, or a public approval. When God reveals a warning, it is not to promote one group over another, but to protect people from confusion, pride, and misplaced trust. A spiritual warning speaks to principles, not personalities. It addresses character, responsibility, accountability, and the condition of the heart. Political messages seek power, votes, and influence. Spiritual messages seek repentance, wisdom, and alignment with God's will. This distinction matters because when people misinterpret spiritual warnings as political attacks, they stop listening and start defending. Truth is then filtered through loyalty instead of discernment. God has a long history of speaking through warnings that challenged leaders without endorsing rebellion or blind support. Biblical prophets confronted kings not to destroy them, but to call them back to humility and obedience. These warnings were never about personal hatred or public humiliation. They were about preventing greater damage. In the same way, a warning concerning a modern leader is not meant to elevate opposition or fuel division, but to awaken responsibility in both the leader and the people who follow. Another danger addressed in this point is the tendency to idolize leaders. When spiritual messages are reduced to politics, people begin to defend individuals instead of examining values. They excuse behavior they would otherwise condemn simply because the person represents their side. This is spiritually dangerous. God never asks his people to defend human pride. He asks them to uphold truth. A warning becomes necessary when loyalty to a person replaces loyalty to righteousness. This key point also reminds believers that God's voice is not partisan. God can speak correction to leaders he once used, and he can warn nations that once prospered. A warning does not mean rejection. It means there is still time to realign. But when warnings are dismissed as attacks, opportunities for correction are lost. What makes this message serious is not who it is about, but what it reveals about how easily spiritual discernment can be drowned out by political emotion. Above all, this spiritual warning calls for maturity. It challenges listeners to separate faith from fandom, conviction from convenience, and truth from tribalism. When people can hear a warning without immediately labeling it, they create space for reflection, prayer, and accountability. That space is where transformation begins. One of the most misunderstood truths in spiritual life is the idea that being used by God means being approved in every area of life. Scripture and history consistently show that God often chooses imperfect leaders to accomplish his purposes, not because of their perfection, but because of his sovereignty. However, divine use never cancels divine accountability. In fact, the greater the influence, the greater the responsibility. God has repeatedly worked through leaders with visible flaws, men and women who carried calling alongside weakness. Their imperfections did not disqualify them from being used, but those same imperfections became dangerous when left unchecked. God's grace empowers purpose, but it does not excuse pride, arrogance, cruelty, or moral compromise. When a leader begins to believe that results justify behavior, accountability slowly disappears. This key point highlights a critical tension. God can use someone powerfully and still confront them firmly. Being an instrument does not make someone immune to correction. In many cases, leaders assume that success is proof of God's approval, but success can also be a test. Influence reveals character more than it builds it. When pressure increases, what is hidden in the heart comes to the surface. Another aspect of accountability is the impact of leadership on others. Leaders do not sin in isolation. Their actions affect nations, families, and generations. That is why God holds leaders to a higher standard. Words spoken casually by a powerful figure can shape attitudes, deepen division, or normalize behavior that harms others. God sees not only intention, but consequence. This point also serves as a warning to followers. When people excuse wrongdoing because God is using them, they participate in the erosion of accountability. True spiritual maturity allows people to acknowledge that God can work through someone while still recognizing the need for correction. Loyalty to truth must be stronger than loyalty to personality. Accountability is not punishment, it is protection. God's correction is often a sign of continued purpose, not rejection. But when leaders resist correction, surround themselves with constant praise, and silence warning voices, accountability is replaced by isolation. History shows that downfall often begins not with failure, but with the refusal to listen. This key point challenges both leaders and listeners to embrace a balanced understanding. God's sovereignty does not eliminate human responsibility. Calling does not override character, and being used by God is not a license to act without restraint. It is a call to walk with even greater humility and fear of God. One of the most dangerous spiritual misunderstandings is the belief that divine selection equals divine approval in all things. God choosing a person for a purpose does not mean God endorses every decision, every word, or every behavior that person displays. Calling speaks to assignment, but approval speaks to obedience. Confusing the two leads to pride, self-justification, and resistance to correction. Throughout history, God has appointed individuals for specific roles, yet still confronted them when they stepped outside His will. Being chosen establishes responsibility, not immunity. In fact, the moment someone begins to believe that their calling places them above correction, they step into spiritual danger. God's favor is never permission to ignore His standards. This key point exposes how people often misread success as validation. When results are visible, crowds gather, influence grows, victories are won. People assume God must approve everything happening behind the scenes. But God may allow success for a season while still calling for repentance. Silence from heaven is not agreement. Patience is not permission. Another serious issue arises when followers defend every action of a chosen leader as if questioning them is questioning God. This mindset shuts down discernment and elevates a human vessel to a divine level. But God has never asked His people to protect leaders from accountability. He asks them to test spirits, examine fruit, and remain anchored in truth rather than emotion. This point also reveals how unchecked authority can slowly drift away from obedience. When correction is resisted, leaders begin to listen only to voices that affirm them. Over time, they may interpret personal desires as divine direction. What began as a genuine calling can be distorted by ego, pressure, or the need for constant validation. God's approval is connected to alignment with His character, justice, humility, truth, and love. When actions contradict these values, correction becomes necessary, regardless of how significant the calling may be. God may still use someone's position, but that does not mean He agrees with their posture. Understanding this key point restores balance. It reminds both leaders and followers that God's authority is higher than any human assignment. Being chosen is a privilege, but obedience is a requirement. And when obedience is replaced with self-confidence, even a divine calling can become a source of conflict rather than fulfillment. Power does not change who a person is. It reveals and amplifies what already exists within them. When influence increases, character is placed under a magnifying glass. Strengths become more visible, but so do weaknesses. If humility, discipline, and reverence for God are present, power can expand purpose and bring stability. But if pride, insecurity, or self-glorification are present, power multiplies their effects just as quickly. This key point highlights why leadership is one of the greatest spiritual tests. Power gives access, control, and visibility, and these elements can either be used to serve or to dominate. When leaders operate with a clear sense of calling and submission to God, power becomes a tool for order, protection, and progress. However, when power feeds ego, it begins to demand loyalty instead of accountability. Pride often grows silently alongside success. At first, confidence feels necessary, then admiration feels deserved, and eventually correction feels like an attack. Power can create an environment where a leader is constantly praised but rarely challenged. Over time, this atmosphere distorts perception, making it difficult to distinguish between God's voice and personal desire. Another danger of power is the temptation to act without restraint. When consequences seem distant or avoidable, decisions become impulsive. Words are spoken without weighing their impact. Actions are justified by position rather than principle. This is how purpose can slowly drift into pressure, where maintaining authority becomes more important than honoring truth. This key point also applies to those who follow powerful leaders. The more power a leader holds, the more people are tempted to excuse behavior they would not tolerate elsewhere. Power creates influence over narratives, and narratives can redefine right and wrong if not grounded in moral clarity. When followers celebrate strength without examining character, pride is reinforced on both sides. Power itself is not evil, it is a responsibility. God grants influence so that order can be established and people can be served. But when power is no longer surrendered daily to God, it begins to serve the self. That is when purpose becomes vulnerable and pride begins to compete with calling. Humility is the stabilizing force of leadership. Without it, authority becomes heavy, communication becomes harsh, and unity begins to fracture. Leadership was never designed to dominate hearts, but to guide them. When humility is absent, leaders may still command attention, but they lose the ability to build lasting trust. Influence remains, but harmony disappears. This key point reveals how division often begins at the top. A leader who cannot listen, reflect, or admit limitations creates an environment where disagreement is treated as disloyalty. Over time, this mindset divides people into categories: those who agree and those who oppose, leaving no room for wisdom, dialogue, or growth. Humility invites conversation, pride enforces control. Another danger of leadership without humility is the misuse of language. Words become weapons rather than bridges. Instead of calming tensions, speech intensifies them. Instead of uniting people around shared values, communication polarizes them around personalities. When a leader speaks without humility, followers often mirror that tone, multiplying division throughout communities and institutions. Humility also determines how leaders respond to correction. A humble leader sees correction as protection. A prideful leader sees it as an attack. When correction is rejected, accountability collapses and division deepens. Advisors are replaced with cheerleaders, and truth is filtered through personal comfort. This isolation at the top eventually weakens leadership from within. This key point extends beyond the leader to the people. When humility is not modeled, followers learn to choose sides rather than seek understanding. Communities fracture, families argue, and shared purpose is lost. Division thrives where humility is absent because there is no common ground, only competing egos. Leadership rooted in humility acknowledges that authority is entrusted, not owned. It recognizes that strength is most effective when paired with restraint. Without humility, leadership may appear powerful on the surface, but underneath, it creates tension, resentment, and separation that slowly erode the very foundation it stands on. Influence is a powerful force, and when it grows beyond restraint, it becomes dangerous. Influence shapes opinions, attitudes, and behavior, often without people realizing it. A leader's words can calm storms or ignite fires, heal divisions or deepen wounds. When influence is exercised without wisdom, discipline, and self-control, it begins to produce consequences that extend far beyond the individual. This key point emphasizes that not every thought needs to be spoken and not every reaction needs to be expressed. Leaders with great influence must weigh their words carefully because their voices carry weight. A careless statement can spread faster than truth, creating fear, anger, or misunderstanding. When restraint is absent, influence becomes impulsive rather than intentional. Another issue arises when influence is driven by emotion instead of discernment. Emotional leadership often reacts instead of reflecting. Decisions are made to satisfy supporters, silence critics, or assert dominance rather than to serve the greater good. Over time, this creates instability, as people never know whether leadership will act with wisdom or volatility. Influence without restraint also blurs moral boundaries. When leaders realize they can say or do almost anything without immediate consequences, limits slowly disappear. Standards are lowered, language becomes harsher, and behavior that was once unacceptable is normalized. What begins as boldness gradually becomes recklessness. This key point also reveals how unrestrained influence affects followers. Supporters often adopt the same tone, attitudes, and behavior they see modeled. Division multiplies, respect erodes, and conflict becomes a culture rather than an exception. Influence spreads not only ideas, but also conduct. Restraint is not weakness, it is strength under control. God values self-control because it protects both the leader and the people they serve. When restraint is ignored, consequences may not appear immediately, but they are inevitable. Influence that is not governed by wisdom eventually turns against the very purpose it was meant to serve. When leaders are idolized, a dangerous spiritual shift takes place. Respect turns into reverence, support turns into defense at all costs, and admiration slowly replaces discernment. God never intended human leaders to occupy a sacred place in the hearts of people. Leadership is meant to be honored, but worship belongs to God alone. When that boundary is crossed, both the leader and the nation begin to suffer. Idolization places unrealistic expectations on leaders. People begin to believe that one individual can save a nation, fix every problem, or represent absolute truth. This mindset removes the need for prayer and replaces dependence on God with dependence on human strength. When outcomes disappoint, as they inevitably do, frustration, anger, and division follow. A nation becomes emotionally tied to a person instead of spiritually anchored in God. This key point also exposes how idolization silences accountability. When leaders are elevated to untouchable status, a criticism is seen as betrayal and correction is treated as hatred. Followers rush to defend behavior they would normally question, simply because acknowledging fault would threaten the image they have built. In such an environment, truth becomes negotiable and moral clarity is sacrificed to preserve loyalty. Prayer, on the other hand, keeps perspective intact. When people pray for leaders, they acknowledge that leaders are human, limited, and in need of wisdom beyond themselves. Prayer invites God into decision-making, restrains pride, and creates room for humility. Idolization removes that invitation. It assumes the leader already knows best and needs no divine guidance or correction. Another consequence of idolization is division within the nation. People begin to identify themselves by their allegiance to a leader rather than shared values or common purpose. Communities fracture into opposing camps, each defending their chosen figure with emotional intensity. Dialogue disappears, compassion weakens, and unity becomes impossible because the focus is no longer on what is right, but on who is right. This key point also warns leaders themselves. Being idolized is spiritually dangerous. Constant praise can distort judgment, inflate ego, and isolate leaders from honest voices. When leaders are surrounded only by admiration, they lose the ability to self-examine. Without prayer covering them, pressure increases, mistakes multiply, and the weight of expectation becomes unbearable. A nation remains healthy when leaders are prayed for, not placed on pedestals. Prayer acknowledges God as the ultimate authority and leaders as servants, not saviors. When prayer is replaced with idolization, nations slowly drift from humility to arrogance, from wisdom to emotion, and from stability to spiritual imbalance. Charisma can attract crowds, but character sustains purpose. God has never been impressed by outward confidence, powerful speech, or public appeal alone. While charisma may open doors and draw attention, it is character that determines whether someone can be trusted with long-term influence. This key point emphasizes that God evaluates leaders from the inside out, measuring integrity, humility, and faithfulness rather than image and performance. Charismatic leaders often inspire strong emotional reactions. People feel energized, hopeful, and motivated by their presence. While this can be beneficial, it also carries risk. When charisma becomes the primary measure of leadership, people stop asking deeper questions about values, consistency, and moral direction. A leader may sound strong and appear decisive, yet lack the inner discipline required to lead responsibly. God's concern with character means He watches how leaders act when no cameras are present. He examines how they treat opposition, handle criticism, and respond to pressure. Character is revealed in private decisions long before it is exposed in public moments. Charisma can cover weaknesses for a time, but character determines how those weaknesses are addressed or ignored. This key point also challenges followers to mature in discernment. When people prioritize charisma, they often excuse behavior that contradicts God's standards. They confuse confidence with righteousness and bold speech with truth. Over time, this lowers moral expectations, not only for leaders, but for society as a whole. What is celebrated publicly eventually becomes accepted culturally. Another danger of valuing charisma over character is instability. Charisma depends on mood, momentum, and public reaction. Character provides consistency. When leadership is driven by charisma alone, direction can shift with emotions, applause, or outrage. God seeks leaders who are steady, not just striking, faithful, not just famous. God's concern for character is ultimately an act of protection. Strong character guards leaders from self-destruction and protects people from being misled. When character is neglected, influence may grow quickly, but it also collapses suddenly. Charisma may win moments, but character determines legacy.